And I'll explain how I became interested in the questions that I'm going to discuss with you. I was a graduate student in folklore at the University of California, and there were a number of Celticists on the faculty, and then I started getting interested in Irish stories, and then I decided to do my dissertation on contemporary Irish storytelling. Is this okay or too close to my mic? Okay. So I went over in 1981 and did 3 months research among traditional storytellers. And they were people to whom I had been referred by the faculty at UCD in the Department of Irish Folklore, and also the folklore collectors themselves and the staff. And I was interviewing storytellers in English. And I became aware in interviewing them that the only audience that they had for their stories were folklore collectors. They had virtually no natural context left for the telling of stories. They weren't telling them to their families, they weren't telling them in pubs, and they weren't the kind of stories that would have been told in pubs anyway. So I became interested in the idea that rather than the old cliche that the storytellers were dying out, that it was actually the audience for the stories that had died out. The storytellers had outlived the viable context for the tradition. So I went back again in 1983 and 84, and I was there for almost a whole academic year. And through all the contacts I had, I started interviewing storytellers all over the country. And basically, I was looking at 3 different things: their life histories, the impact on their lives and on their storytelling of their interactions with folklore collectors, because all of these people had been interviewed by the collectors from the department, and also their story repertoires. You know, getting a good overview of what kinds of stories they knew and the context in which they learned them. So, and for a little bit of background information, what you need to know is that there are 2 branches of Irish storytelling. One is called Scéalaíocht, which refers to all of the stories that fall in the category of long, complex, multi-episodic tales. And these would be international folk tales, Irish versions of international folk tales, exempla, stories about saints, religious stories, and most importantly, Scéalta Gaisce, which are the hero tales. And we'll come back to this again because the Scéalta Gaisce are very important in terms of folklore collecting. So that's the main branch of the storytelling tradition. The other one is Seanachas. And Seanachí is literally a historian, but Seanachas refers to all the shorter, more anecdotal stories. Stories about apparitions, about fairies, about supernatural encounters of all kinds. It includes family history and local history, legends of all kinds, charms and prayers, and almost everything that isn't part of Scéalaíocht falls into the category of Seanachas. And Scéalaíocht is considered the purview of men, and Seanachas is considered the purview of women, and that they excel the men in this branch of the tradition. So these are important assumptions about really the gendered aspects of folklore collecting. So I want to read to you. This is from his address. I can see with this microphone. This is Seamus Delargy's, and he addressed to the British Academy in 1945. And this is, these assumptions about the roles of men and women became axiomatic in the tradition itself and in the scholarship related to the tradition. Okay, so this is a quote from Delargy in 1945. The recital of Oceanic, that is Fenian, stories about Finn and the Fianna. The recital of oceanic tales was almost without exception restricted to men. There are exceptions to this rule, but the evidence is unmistakable that the telling by women of Finn tales was frowned upon by the men. Sheana's genealogical lore, music, folk prayers were, as a rule, associated with women. At any rate, they excel the men in these branches of the tradition, while women do not take part in the storytelling. Not a word of the tale escapes them, and it is no uncommon experience of mine to hear the listening woman interrupt and correct the speaker. So here we have Delargy's reiteration that women are not participating in storytelling. And Angela Burke, the great scholar of women's issues in Ireland, points out that while the branches of the tradition have not historically been regarded as gender specific, they do represent assumptions about gender roles. And as we mentioned, Gaelic belongs to the men, Sheana's belongs to the women. Delargy mentioned several women narrators, including the great Pegsaers, who were narrators of Fenian tales and also Merchen, which are the international wonder tales. So Fenian tales and Merchen, and including Pegsaers, but clearly regards women tellers of these stories as exceptional. And he quotes Jeremiah Curtin, who was the great Irish-American collector, who stated that women were inferior narrators of Svíalta Gaisce, the hero tales. And Curtin says, I quote, "In Ireland I have found few women who can tell tales at all, and few who can compare with the best men." So here we have this idea being reiterated over and over and over again. The women just sat there saying nothing basically except talking about eggs and chickens and, you know, what do you talk about if you can't tell a story? There's not much left of interest. Okay, and even Sean O'Sullivan, who did the first really commercially successful collection of Irish folktales, which you can still find, which is called Folktales of Ireland, made this comment: in general, women storytellers were less numerous than men. And Delargy's assertions have been codified in the tradition and the scholarship, as I mentioned. So we have this idea that somehow women were telling stories. and or that they were inferior storytellers to the men. Okay. So I'm going to go back to what is the really critical element of this appraisal, because when I was conducting my fieldwork and I interviewed 45 different people, including storytellers in both language traditions and folklore collectors, people knowledgeable about storytelling in their localities. And the men would almost always say, oh, the women didn't tell stories. Because very offhandedly, the women didn't tell stories. If you asked them about the stories, women didn't tell stories. So I became intrigued by this, knowing it's simply impossible to be that this can be true. And we do have knowledge of exceptional storytellers who were women. So the real problem is the lack of in situ documentation of Irish storytelling as a whole since the very beginning of formal collecting on an organized scale. Any attempt at systematic collecting really began in 1926, and when we had the Folklore of Ireland Society, and that had several reiterations until it became the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s, and it became the Department of Irish Folklore at Dublin, at UCD, in 1971. So it's that recent that we still have this idea being reiterated. Okay. Well, at the time that folklore collecting commenced on anything approaching a systematic basis or an attempt at one, there really was, it was the 1920s, and so there was a deep sense of cultural loss regarding the language and this desire to affirm the national identity of a new state. So you have this momentum towards the affirmation of cultural identity, which is actually going on all over Europe, in Germany, up in Scandinavia, in different places. The same motivations are operating. So, sense of cultural loss, a desire to build a sense of cultural identity, and critical to this is the salvage emphasis, the idea that they're trying to collect the remnants of a tradition that is dying out, so that ultimately will completely disappear. And because they felt the very best examples of Irish storytelling would be in the Irish language, the overwhelming body of material in the archives in Dublin is in Irish. It's a very small percentage that's being collected from English speakers. And what they especially, part of this is simply that there were insufficient resources to cover the whole country systematically, which Irish folklore scholars have always acknowledged. And insufficient resources both in terms of personnel, trained collectors, and funding from the national government. So it has never been possible to cover the country systematically, to record everybody who was telling stories. So the emphasis was on the Irish language materials. Now there are other aspects to this. The folklore collectors were also paid for the volume of material that they collected. They were actually paid by manuscript pages that resulted from their Edaphone recordings. They used the wax cylinders on the old Edaphone machines, and they would transcribe those by hand into these huge, this is thousands and thousands of volumes of handwritten transcriptions in the Department of Irish Folklore, thousands and thousands. And so they were all transcribed by hand. The original recordings were lost because the cylinders were reused. So what the folklore collectors were seeking were the tellers of the long, structurally complex tales, partially because of this financial inducement, largely because they felt these were the really richest materials in Irish tradition and the materials most in danger of dying out. But the fact was that it was men who were considered to be the narrators of these forms of stories, these categories of stories. And they were simply more likely to be sought out. So men were far more likely to be sought out than women, who were considered to be the narrators, the par excellence of these short narrative forms, Shishkelta, legends, family history. Okay, another aspect that will come back into the discussion is that the Irish tales have a kind of, the Skelta Gashka, the hero tales, have a kind of archaic language associated with them, which is called Cruagelga, Hard Irish. And this, and they also have the runs. The hero tales have these runs of heavily formulaic diction, that these were descriptive passages that fit with stock scenes. And we have these in Serbo-Croatia, we have them in the Homeric epics. They're in Native American tradition where you have very formulaic. So the storytellers would know these passages of Cruagelga, the runs or rans are sometimes called, and in Irish they're called many names, but often Corriu Cahan, which means preparation for battle. So the storytellers were seeking out the individuals who had this command of this very specialized language. Okay. So we've covered the fact that they were looking for the narrators of the longer narrative forms, especially Shanshkelta, which are international folktales, Irish settings of international folktales, like those of the Brothers Grimm, and Skelta Gashka in particular, because the runs were associated with with heroic narrative. Okay. So women tended to be neglected because they were looking for these prime examples of the Irish language. Okay. So men were just more likely to be sought out for recording purposes. Now, the second critical problem. This is a lot to get in 25 minutes. I'm going to drink my mind. Hold on a minute. I actually used to use these teaching when I had big classes, and I always hate things over my head, but I am used to having them in front of my mouth. Okay. Now, second most critical problem besides the emphasis on the stories associated with men. Since the beginning of organized, professional, paid, trained folklore collecting by folklore collectors, none of them were women. Yeah? That's starting from way back in the 1920s until the collectors of my generation, Barbara Neefloin and Rihanna Cohogoin in Dublin. Probably they're both retired now, since they're more or less my age. But those have been the only two professional full-time collectors working for the Department of Irish Folklore and their antecedent bodies over the course of the whole last century up to the present. So all of the folklore collectors have been men. Okay. So this, if you think about this, common sense tells you that this has an effect on stories that are recorded. Okay. The primary context for the telling of traditional storytellers is known in Irish as ar cuairt, meaning on a visit, but we know it as caling or going to rambling houses, and it's known as courtship, bohanchip. It has many, many names in Irish and in English, dozens of them. But the whole custom of nightly visiting was the primary context in which traditional stories were heard, learned, and told. And this is where men and women would have heard stories from their neighbors, their relatives, their friends, in this nightly visiting, which was the ubiquitous form of entertainment in the countryside until quite recently in this century. Okay. So the other thing is that even though this was not invariably the case, usually men and women went visiting in same-sex groups. So the men would go to the houses favored by men, the women would go to houses favored by women. So you had Arnyan Ban and Arnyan Far, referring to, a particular house where women would go, a particular house where men would go. Far is man, of course, and Ban is woman. Okay. So we have the fact that we have visiting going on in same-sex groups. Although this wasn't invariably the case because, of course, some women had to stay home. They had children. So there were mixed groups, but generally speaking, they were same-sex groups. Okay. At the time that I was doing my research, I interviewed 4 women storytellers. 2 who were storytellers in Irish, 2 who were storytellers in English. And it's a very strange thing. All of them lost their mothers, either at their birth or at the birth of subsequent children. So none of them actually grew up with their natural mothers. So they all experienced storytelling in same-sex groups, women's groups. One of them, she had 5 aunts and 5 uncles, and the women would go off together to an Arnyan Ban, where women would tell stories. They would have the opportunity, if they were at home, sometimes neighbors would come in, and they would hear the stories that were told by men and the stories that were told by women. So it's only it's a mixed bag. Everybody heard lots of different kinds of stories. And so some would have heard more shakas, others would have had the opportunity to hear Sheana, the American, the international folk tales, and the hero tales. But it was very strongly considered to be boyish, to be telling hero tales. And one of the storytellers I recorded up in the Crows in Donegal told me that her grandmother told her she'd be making a tomboy of herself, telling those stories. That's a quote, you'll be making a tomboy of yourself. So she obviously heard these stories. So it's a mixed bag what stories women actually did hear. I mentioned about Fertier. So, but it's important that both men and women heard women who were narrators of Sheana. So when we talked to the men, I talked to one man, his name escapes me at the moment, come to me, but his mother told him versions of the Grimm's tales as bedtime stories, so he actually heard these kinds of stories from his mother, told in a setting that's very private, very different from competitive storytelling in a group situation. Okay. So if we think that the most important kinds of visiting were in same-sex groups, it has implications for how well women's stories can be documented if none of the collectors were women. It wouldn't be, for a male to come into an all-female group, changes the dynamics of group interaction. Different norms of appropriateness come into play. So it's actually a very profound obstacle that there were no women collectors who could collect the stories in women's group, where their presence would be appropriate and not, you wouldn't have all these complex social norms at play when you have a man comes into a group. Okay. So what I'm suggesting, it's hypothetical, and I've written an article about this, and in which I made this suggestion, that it's possible that more women told stories than we know about. It's completely likely, in my mind, that there were many more women storytellers than have ever been recorded, but that if we take these same-sex groups, that more women might step forward as storytellers. They might feel more comfortable telling stories. I mean, we're like that. When men come into a group, it changes the dynamics of the group interaction. So more women may have told stories in same-sex groups. They may have told stories associated with men. They might have told very different kinds of stories. Hypothetically, they might have told stories that were more sexually charged or blue material, or because we know from other traditions that this happens when you have all-female groups. And Angela Burke had done some work with the Walking Songs of Scotland, and that's W-A-U-K-I-N-G. It's a way of treating cloth with soapy water and urine. And women would gather in same-sex groups. Men were never part of these groups. And Angela has reported that they discuss childbirth, they discuss menstruation, they discuss their relationships with their husbands, they discuss their children, they discuss all kinds of topics that would simply have never come up in a group where men were present. And certainly a folklore collector could never come into such a setting and hope to get any kind of natural interaction going among the women. Okay, so their stories, it's just quite a possibility that more women told stories, and they may have told more transgressive stories. And we just don't know because there's no documentation. And the folklore collector for many, many years in Donegal was Sean O'Haughey. Some of you may be familiar with his name. But Sean mentioned to me in conversation that a kind of transhumance or transhumance was practiced in Donegal, where the cattle were taken from the lowlands in summer up to the summer milking places by the women. So the women went together in groups and they lived in cabins where they would do spinning, knitting, butter making. They had ceilidhs and they sang, but there's no documentation of any of this, and they don't have any idea what kind of stories they told, if they told stories. And I'm sure they told the stories. So, Anestin Evans points out in Irish Folkways that marginal conditions of any kind in any culture frequently lead to the breakdown of the usual social norms. So, you know, really, all these, since all the men said to me, you know, the women didn't tell stories. The women didn't tell stories, you know, just very authentically, very casual. And I was scratching my head knowing that this couldn't possibly be true. And so we've got this situation where we have this enormous record of material that we know can't be an accurate representation of the kinds of storytelling that women did. And it's inadequate in terms of the information we can glean from it about the kinds of stories that they told, but also how did women treat traditional aspects of male culture in the stories that they did tell. Okay, so there's an American folklorist, Deborah Kaddish, who mentions, who has done work on the interactions among folklorists and storytellers when they're male and when they're female. The collectors, I mean, and the storytellers as well. So the presence of male collectors always affects norms of appropriateness, and gender relations are always present as subtext in any of the records that are in existence, extant in the Irish, in the archives of the Department of Irish Folklore. It's just inherent in the relationships involved. So, and another factor that comes in is that the collectors were also high-status male visitors relative to the women, and the men too, for that matter, for the people they were recording. Okay, so it's important to take into account that many performances take place in the private sphere of domestic life for women's storytelling. And we know more women, we know that women were more housebound than men, and that the context in which they told stories, taking care of children, maybe doing household tasks with other women, were not conducive to intrusion by men, folklore collectors, male folklore collectors. So performances in the private sphere of women's domestic life favor privacy and intimacy over attention and competition that's characteristic in most cultures of typically male storytelling. And then, because, has everyone heard of Peg Sayers? Yeah. I'm assuming everybody, almost everybody would have. But she's, I mean, I hate to use the expression, but if anybody knows of any Irish women storytellers, it will be Peg Sayers, so she's kind of considered the queen of Irish women storytellers. But Peg learned her stories from her father, and none of her father's stories have been recorded, but there have been recordings of stories of other male relatives of Peg's. And certain folklorists have done work analyzing the content of Peg Sayers' stories relative to her male relatives. And they have found that Peg focused more on the hard lot of women and their need to stand by each other in a patriarchal world. So her treatment of traditional aspects of male culture is quite different to her male relatives. And so this is just an enigma that only a very deep analysis of all of the volumes that are available in the archives, some kind of analysis of this can yield its information on how women treated traditional aspects of male culture. So that's more or less, those are my main points. And I just wanted to say that in conclusion that as yet there has been no in-depth analysis of Irish narratives to analyze how women's perspective inform the content and treatment of aspects of traditional male culture. But it's a job that only women can really do. And so whoever follows Rianuk and Barbara has a big job on her hands. We'll see.